Hi, and welcome to the session, The Power of Legislating Against Tech-Facilitated Gender-Based Abuse. I have an incredible group of women who are all doing incredible work making changes around the legislative response to tech-facilitated gender-based harm. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce you to everybody. We have Valdez. She is an award-winning actress, filmmaker, and survivor advocate. Following the non-consensual leak of her private images in the 2014 iCloud hack, she turned her experience into the acclaimed short film Hacked, helping to raise awareness of the devastating impact of image-based abuse and technology-facilitated violence. We have Cara Hunter, who is a member of the Legislative Assembly of Northern Ireland and an advocate for ending violence against women and girls. After becoming a target of a deepfake image during the election campaign, she successfully campaigned for legal reform and is now a leading voice on the protecting rights and dignity in the digital age. We have Amna, who is a superintendent of police in Pakistan and a leading voice in the gender-responsive policing and public safety. Through her work in law enforcement, she has contributed to efforts to improve institutional responses to violence against women, including harms facilitated through digital technologies. We have Nihat, one of the world's leading digital rights advocates and a dear friend of No More, and the founder of Pakistan's Digital Rights Foundation. Her work to combat online harassment and defend digital freedoms has earned international recognition, including serving on Meta's Oversight Board and the UN Secretary General's AI's Advisory Board. We have Shay, who again is a globally recognized expert on digital safety, governance, and public policy. Her work focuses on building proactive systems of accountability and duty of care, helping governments, platforms, and institutions prevent harm before it occurs, rather than responding after the fact. We have Sarah, who has played an important role in advancing regional approaches to addressing gender-based digital violence in the Americas. Today, she'll share insights from the Inter-America Model Law and its relevance for strengthening protections against technology-facilitated abuse. I am so overwhelmingly chuffed to have all of you in this conversation. I just reading, your work that you've done so far and knowing that this is an incredible opportunity for us to come together to talk about this is very, very important issue. So I'm going to start, knowing that we only have not enough time, to Aldis, if you wouldn't mind starting our conversation today. We know that what we'll talk about and what you probably have heard throughout the Tech Summit are conversations around policy, laws, practical responses around tech-facilitated gender-based harm. But it's equally important to understand how these frameworks are experienced by the people whom they are made to protect. So sort of drawing on your own experience as both a survivor and an advocate and filmmaker, what legal protection do you wish had existed when your images first leaked? Bearing in mind this is 2014, so we're a good 12 years on in the journey. So it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that, Elise.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I would like to share that once I became a victim of all this, I realized how badly the system is created to not really protect survivors at all. And when this happened to me, I waited for 8 years for someone else to step up and do something about it. And as the time just kept passing by, I was thinking to myself, well, why don't I just share my story and why don't I try to do something about it, right? So what happened was that I created a law or a bill called the Protect Act, which is a bill that verifies age and consent for uploaders to adult platforms. And I also created a nonprofit called Foundation Raw. So Foundation Raw is something that I really wish that also existed at the time. We do free takedown services, legal advice, therapy, and all kinds of other resources about laws in different countries and states and so on. And this year alone, we have already taken down 200,000 takedown requests. So, with that being said, I realized that now more than ever, the takedown system is not a system that works. And, for the most part, in all of the countries, we're doing, these takedown laws that tell survivors that you can take down your non-consensual content, or you can sue your predator that have shared these non-consensual content, right? So that's not really the solution. I believe that we need prevention before harm ever occurs. And if the harm never occurs, we don't need to chase a million takedowns. We don't need to chase, lawsuits and all of those kind of things. So I think that that's the solution.
Thanks for that. I mean, absolutely. And in a way that leads on quite beautifully to the rest of the questions that we'll talk about this afternoon.
Yeah.
Before we jump into the prevention piece, I suppose there's something around that many parts of the world, many different governments are really looking into the legislation around tech facilitated gender-based harm. And we're seeing bursts of legislation have come about, and you're seeing great celebrations that this legislation is now in place. And in really sort of speaking to what you're saying is how impactful is this for victim survivors and how easy it is for them to use it. I suppose my question to the entire panel, and perhaps starting with you, Sarah, what is the most important feature, do you think, for effective legislation to occur?
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the No More team, to UN Women for this opportunity. It is an honor for the Organization of American States, especially the mechanism, the follow-up mechanism to the Belém do Pará Convention, to be part of this space. I think that the most effective thing a law should have to be effective is to be comprehensive. As it was just mentioned, it can be only from a punitive perspective. We cannot keep creating laws just thinking criminalizing a conduct. We must go further than that. So we need to start in the prevention. We need to educate. We need to sensibilize. We need to add this perspective to any kind of law that we think of when we start the legislative process. But not only that, it should be a multi-stakeholder action. We need to include every stakeholder part of the digital environment in this construction of responses. The Inter-American Model Law to Prevent, Punish, and Eradicate Gender-Based Digital Violence Against Women proposes states in all its branches, but also tech companies, civil society organizations, survivors, everyone should be sitting down and thinking about how can we address these problems, because survivors, civil society organizations, they are starting to understand how these problems work, but they cannot find the right solutions without the help of the technology experts, without the help of the technology companies, who are the ones who can actually take down the content or actually take action towards cases of digital violence. So for me, all actors, and for me and for the perspective of the mechanism, all actors should be involved in that solution, not only the state, which is why no longer we cannot think about regulating the justice system is enough. We need to think about regulation for the technology industry. Almost every industry is already regulated. So any kind of legislation about digital violence or about technology facilitated violence should include a perspective of technology regulation. It's not enough to look at it as a human rights problem. We now need to involve everyone around it.
Thank you for that, Sarah. That's actually really interesting and quite an interesting new perspective. Nihad, what are your thoughts?
First of all, I'm really thankful that I'm here with such a distinguished panel and some of familiar faces and my friends in the ecosystem. I think the first thing I'd say is we have to be careful whose lessons we are drawing from. There is this pattern that we have seen that global majority countries have to learn lessons from global North, or there is an assumption that they are waiting to learn from Europe or North America or whatever. But actually, some of the most contextually grounded legal innovation is happening in our part of the world, often with far fewer resources and far higher stakes. And we have a Pakistani example. Digital Rights Foundation has started working on tech facilitated gender-based violence back in 2012, 2013. And we also have this experience and an honest lesson from Pakistan when it comes to legislation is that legislation without survivor-centered design is just a performance. We have laws on the books, which is Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, and it includes electronic harassment provisions. And but what we have seen so far is, and this law was enacted in 2016. But what we are seeing is that women still routinely don't report, not because the law doesn't exist, but because they don't really trust the process. They fear secondary harm from the very institutions meant to help them, or the digital evidence standards are impossible to meet in practice. So the lesson isn't get a law passed. I think the lesson is who was in the room when it was drafted. I mean, as Sarah also mentioned, if it wasn't the survivors, if it wasn't frontline organizations, if it wasn't the women most exposed to this harm, the law will protect the more powerful more than it protects vulnerable community. And we learned the hard way with Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, which has been used to sadly used to silence journalists and activists far more than it's been used to protect women from harassment. I'll just stop here, but I think there are some really good lessons in several jurisdictions that we can learn from, but also very innovative approaches around addressing tech-facilitated gender-based violence as well, beyond regulatory frameworks and policies.
Oh, thank you for everything you heard. Shay, what are your thoughts on what is the most important feature?
Thank you. And yeah, just to say thank you so much, Lindsay and the No More team for organizing this. It can feel like, oh, do we have time to have another conversation? But it is in the conversation and the sharing that we're going to learn and not repeat the mistakes that we are still seeing and battling. Because, you know, for a lot of us, we've been talking about this since 2014. So it's a long time coming, right? I think the one feature that is important that I see missing is prevention, is foreseeability. Quite a lot of the responses, actions are quite reactive. And so it means that we're on a drumbeat that is set by tech domination, tech extraction. It doesn't seem to be foreseeable. And that feels inefficient, it feels ineffective, and it feels like a big waste of people's time and resources. If we designed legislation and frameworks that around violence against women and girls on that spectrum of online to offline, where we already have the evidence of what is happening, then that already sets us apart in foreseeing the harms, rather than, oh my God, we didn't know this was happening. Oh, this is a kind of glitch in the system, which is where my work started, in kind of fixing the glitches. Over the last 9 years, I've really understood that these glitches actually are designed and embedded into the system. So if we actually start thinking about how do we respond proactively, foreseeably, and also design around health, right? How do we design around healthy conversations, healthy dialogues that we want people to be having online and offline and with themselves? We completely flip the way in which tech is designed and governed and regulated.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Amna, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then Cora, I'll come back to you.
Thank you. I think most of the stuff has already been said, but I'd just like to add to what Nigat just said about having everybody in the room. I'd start by saying that justice delayed in technology-facilitated gender-based violence is injustice multiplied. So we see that the content, if it's not taken down in time, it can lead to more harm that manifests in offline repercussions for most of the women in our country, our part of the world. But I'd also question about what Jassia said, that are we just talking about how much harm exists, who all are at stake, what sort of harm manifests when we talk about technology-facilitated gender-based violence, and moving towards the reaction part of how are we responding to that harm. Nigat said that she has been working in this space since 2012. I received my first complaint as a law enforcement officer of technology facilitated gender-based violence back in 2018, and this is 2026, and we're still talking about legislation. So just adding to what was just being said, I think one of the most important lessons for me as a law enforcement officer has been that when we talk about the room where the laws are drafted, we also need to take into account what the first responders are seeing on ground, how the complaints, how the nature of the complaints are changing, how the harms are manifesting. So when I was drafting the national strategy for Pakistan to address technology facilitated gender-based violence, in the national consultations, I went to one part of Pakistan which is considered a rural area. And a man told me that previously we would throw acid on a woman's face to ruin her life. Now we just generate an AI generated explicit content of that particular woman and circulate that, and it has the same impact on her life. So then my question is that how are laws taking into account the impact that such content has on women whose lives are completely ruined if something like that goes out, right? So one, the laws need to take into cognizance the contextualized manifestation of the problem in a particular country and a region. The second thing I would say is that we talk about the survivor-centric approaches. We talk about how can the survivor approach the system, but we also forget, as a law enforcement officer, to talk about something that is always up my mind is what happens. Is taking down the complete and whole justice for the survivor? Is that it? Is that all we are doing? Or should we also be talking about what justice entails for a woman whose life is ruined because a picture was circulated in a very traditional society such as ours? So then again, like, what are the sentencing guidelines? How are the systems responding to it? How, as Nigat said, like, the system can take evidence into account with proper standard procedure, operating procedures in place, so that it's not misused. But more importantly, I feel that we need to also be talking about in these platforms about the conviction rates. So what are the conviction rates in cases of technology facilitated gender-based violence across the world, and how this vicious cycle is stopped? Because it can only be stopped if we are punishing the perpetrators. And if we look at the conviction rates, because I have, it's extremely, extremely low. So that means that the vicious cycle continues. The survivor does not get complete and whole justice. And the system is basically taking it down, is not whole justice for a lot of women in our part of the world whose lives are ruined just because a picture was circulated or something reached where it should not have reached, right? So when we are drafting laws, I think that is something context, the regional consequences, the consequences for women, they're extremely, extremely important. But more than that, I think the baseline assessments are there. We have the civil society organizations who are advocating for the issue since a long, long while, but also the frontline workers should be taken into the process of drafting that law so that they can give their input that what sort of complaints are coming. So yeah, that's all from my side. Apologies if I've taken too much of the time.
No, you have not. Well, you've actually introduced some really interesting thoughts. Thank you so, so much. I really like the idea of the fact of what does justice look like for a survivor, and actually how that it's a journey into that survivor, and what support's available and what that looks like. That's really, really interesting. I will come back to that as we continue. Cara, what are your thoughts about what is the most important feature?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be joined by these incredible women from right across the world. We're all together in arms, I suppose, against this ongoing massive issue. I think for me, in my experience, I think it's about having a full societal approach and rethink about, how we talk about tech facilitated gender-based violence. I think it's really important that we get in early to our schools and to instill into the minds of our young boys who will soon be men about ultimately respect for women and the recognition of the harm that this kind of violence does. It's long lasting, but also it's just at the push of a button that can essentially ruin the life, the reputation of someone with complete ease. And often it's, unbelievably hard to track. So I think, just as other speakers have said, it's about the early, intervention to ensure we're getting in, we're supporting our young people and really talking about sexism and misogyny that exists in our society. And where I come from in Northern Ireland, this is the most unsafe place to be a woman or a girl in Europe. So I think that really speaks to the rise of tech-facilitated gender-based harm in our region. And I think it does come down to the Justice Department looking at, real enforcement here when it comes to these kinds of crimes. And what we have seen a rise of, particularly in the island of Ireland, is, sextortion scams, blackmail with not only real images, but particularly deepfake ones. And that can have a long-lasting mental health impact. So I also think that even when the police services are dealing with victims and survivors of this type of crime, that they're educated, that they have the training, that they have the understanding of the sheer horror and the trauma that victims are going through. So I think this all comes back to being victim-centered, and how can we as a society ensure that we're providing that wraparound support in all sectors so that victims of this kind of crime don't feel alone, because it's a very lonely place to be.
Wow, thank you for that, Cara. And thank you for everyone for your thoughts on what the most important feature should be. A lot of it, you spoke about survivors, the regulation of the industry. Everyone spoke about the importance of prevention, which was really, really interesting. And also about how we need to be thinking about what justice looks like, and for each individual person, and how that can be different. And I thought, Anna, what you were mentioning about how the first responders are equipped with their with the ability to respond effectively, but also to be able to feed back into legislation, to be able to say, these are the things that we're seeing on the ground are incredibly important. So, Nihat, moving on to you, if you don't mind. You said something very, very interesting about how there's been great strides forward in the global south around legislation and innovations which were limited with regards to funding. What are your sort of thoughts about it? Or is there something you can share about that in particular? Because you have worked across the world, across many different countries and communities around building legislation and responding and reporting on that legislation.
And what we really hear every day from victims and survivors who basically, when they reach out to us, they really want to they really want to get to the remedy instead of what basically legislation actually does for them. They are looking for someone to pick up the phone, to be honest, understand what happened to them and help them stop the harm. And really not looking forward to, like the 6-month period when the case is filed and, what the law enforcement will be doing with that. So that's basically the first, my apologies. That's basically the first sort of reaction that we sort of receive from victims and survivors of this harm. And what this experience has really taught me, that legislation is only as good, and as I already mentioned about Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, that it's only as good as what sits behind it. And in most countries, including countries with far more resources than Pakistan, what sits behind it is almost nothing. And I don't know if Amna can speak to that, but we have some specialized unit, but really not doing much around this. No trained investigators, no fast track process for image-based abuse before these images spread further. Really no language support for women who don't speak the dominant national language. So the lesson I'd offer is before you pass the law, map the journey a survivor will actually have to take to use it. Every point where she might give up, be ashamed, be turned away, be told to come back with more evidence. That's a gap your legislation needs to address. And we built our helpline because that journey was impossible. 12 years later, we are still filling gaps the state was supposed to fill. So that's not a success story. That's a policy failure with a civil society workaround.
Thank you so much for that. That's a really, really important piece about mapping the journey and about what somebody goes through and that and when those dropout points. Thank you so much for that. Slightly differently, Cara, you've been successful in changing laws on deepfakes in Northern Ireland. I suppose it's sort of an interesting way. What were the barriers you faced and what made the difference? Like, how did you overcome those?
It's a great question. So when it came to concerns around deepfakes, I have been flagging it since May of 2022, around that time. And we did see a particular rise. I think it was like 780% of deepfakes being created across this island. One of the main barriers, I think, was really conveying to lawmakers here, to our policymakers, that this is going to be a big issue. And some people feel, when it comes to things like AI regulation, deep fakes, that's something that happens over here. It hasn't come to my door. But the reality is, this technology is changing each and every day. And I think we, particularly policymakers and shapers, have a moral and a professional duty to try and get that law changed and fit for purpose and act as that form of early intervention. But I think the hardest thing that I've come up against is the lack of urgency. So a lot of people not taking this technology seriously. We've seen the rise of notification apps, which are absolutely horrific. Again, it's that theme of stripping women of their clothes and stripping them of their dignity. And also making sure that survivors of deepfakes are believed. I think there's a real hesitancy, and victims really feel like nowhere to go, no one to speak to. It's a unique lived experience, seeing your likeness weaponized against you. And oftentimes it's that real feeling of the weaponization of sexuality and how you present as a woman. So the biggest challenges, I think, was really communicating and conveying the trauma that these incidents cause, that tech-facilitated gender-based harm is actually being used as a form of domestic violence and coercive control. I know of one case, a constituent had a deepfake image made of her, and this was threatened to be shared with the local community, local priests, pastors. So it is a tool and mechanism for control, and it all comes down to shame. So for me, I think the biggest challenge was getting our society and our communities to realize that this is a big issue. And lastly, recently, we had young women who have been targeted through blackmail of these images, who are in sports clubs and still in secondary school. So that's the kind of nature of targeting that we're seeing. It's particularly young females. And yeah, I think it's that urgency is what was really difficult to get across.
Well, did you have a similar experience back in 2014?
So in 2014, there was no question about it. When I became a victim, it was a scandal, it was a headline. Nobody cared. There was no, women didn't have any kind of rights when it came to the digital landscape. It was more like, this happened to you, you deserved it, you're asking for it, you're in the public eye, and those kind of situations, right? And as someone who lived it and also have been deep faked and you name it, it just becomes you become a person that people feel entitled to abuse, And what I noticed is, again, that prevention is the actual solution. But prevention before the harm even occurs. That's the actual beneficial solution for everybody here. And here in the US, they have laws like the Take It Down Act, which was actually a part of the Protect Act. And now they're doing something called the Defiance Act, which was also a part of the Protect Act. But those two different pillars within the Protect Act are the smaller parts, like parts that are the Band-Aid solutions, right? And the main core part is the prevention part, which is the age verification and consent for uploaders to adult platforms, right? So again, they're passing these laws that are just Band-Aid solutions, but we're already, the technology is advancing so fast and so rapidly that we're already into Meta glasses, we're into Ray-Ban glasses, nudifying apps like Cara mentioned, and it just keeps advancing, and people feel entitled to abuse women as rapidly as the technology is advancing. And now we're also profiting from it, right? So if you look at the Rape Academy, people drugging and, raping their own wives and girlfriends. And we have these like Facebook group chats, Telegram group chats, where they're just sharing like big groups, 60,000 people, 80,000 people, right? They're just girlfriends, daughters, sisters, anyone that they can abuse and share non-consensually. So I just feel like, we're having so many conversations about it, but we need action. We need prevention. And that's the solution to everything. We could pass as many laws as we want, but unless it gets prevented, then what good is that, right? So Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, Cara. Actually, Shay, this moves beautifully into my question for you around prevention. So if we can also move into that space, really. What does proactive duty of care approach look like in practice for governments and platforms? Big statement, but what does prevention really look like from those angles? Shay, we'll start with you and then I'll move on to.
Well, I think prevention looks at first looks at history. So if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? We know that sentiment very well. And it seems that with every other industry, automobile industry, pharmaceutical industry, even with the COVID-19 injection rollout, there is so much around preventing harm and making sure this is tested. Yes, it can always be better at testing around women's bodies, women's experiences, as we know, but nevertheless it's tested. And my experience in politics, where before you rolled out a new policy, before you made a particular cut, you had to do an equality impact assessment to check that such intervention or cut would not disproportionately impact those that are protected here in the UK under the Equalities Act. That protects vulnerable characteristics such as race, disability, sexuality, to ensure that the intervention or the cut does not disproportionately impact that person. That is a simple governance, simple business practice, simple leadership, in my opinion, practice that tech companies seem to be able to get away with. And I'm not making a blanket statement here because, as you know, and Nagat here too can testify that it is possible to work with tech companies and move them along the journey, right? It is possible to sit on the trust and safety councils of certain platforms and move them along the journey. But the tech sector as a whole seems to be able to have a really good PR campaign to make out like they're a struggling startup company in their mother's basement and they can't work this out. And that is a storytelling piece that I think we're missing. And that's why the terms duty of care, the terms care as infrastructure is the narrative that I'm trying to push into the ecosystem so that we can see that this is a design problem. This is something that actually, why is this industry getting away with it? We can see that also there are moments in particularly a woman's leadership journey or life. We see there are particular vulnerabilities in schools when their body is changing, and also when they're in visibility moments, right? When they get elected, when they start a campaign, whenever they are in the moment of stepping into their power, we notice there are these vulnerabilities and frankly, jealousy and this attack on women stepping into their power. So again, how do we understand that companies and governments have a duty of care to the most vulnerable, and it not be something that is now, please sir, please see me, this kind of begging breadcrumbs that unfortunately I'm starting to see as a narrative, that we're asking for piecemeal things from tech companies, then really saying that actually you're a stakeholder in our world. This is how you need to be governing, how you need to be having, how you need to be practicing. Ultimately, I think we can hold tech companies accountable to a duty of care when it comes to elections. We know that women who are standing, participating, exercising their free speech, exercising their right to express an opinion makes them so vulnerable. So why aren't we seeing a standardized content moderation policy across all platforms when it comes to misogyny in elections? Because we know that misogyny in elections weakens candidates being able to stand and impacts political parties being able to be effective. And as panelists have discussed, AI makes that even harder. So how do we make sure that there are non-negotiables from the beginning of a tech being designed and product development, so that it isn't at these real visible moments, which is what bad actors want, right? They get off on, haha, great, you're talking about me in the papers. And that is, you know, if you again look at old forms of gender-based violence, right? If you look at, if you talk to police officers and detectives, they want to stop copycats of crimes, of serial killers, for example, because people will look at this and think, okay, this is a way of getting famous. So again, it feels like the tools and tactics that we've navigated and used and perfected offline and through history doesn't seem to be applying to this one industry. And why is that? And I think it's a storytelling problem that we have, rather than having the tools and the solutions. The tools and solutions exist right here, but it seems to be storytelling. And finally, one that is probably difficult for a lot of people to discuss, but I think given my experience in politics, it's something that I'm more vocal about, particularly leaving my organization Glitch, is the political component to this. That we are seeing what is happening in the US around tech companies being able to lobby politicians. We are seeing that here in the UK. We are seeing that happen around the world. And my fear is that certain legislation will pass that is around regulating, that will then come back to bite us in the arse. Sorry, but it's true when it comes to surveillance, because there is this lobbying aspect to tech companies and tech bros having an obscene amount of money and been able to impact politics. So again, if we understand that a duty of care is something that can be shared across the board, if we can see that there are foreseeable moments that actually these bad actors want to get famous from, that we can actually design our platforms and our responses so much differently.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much for that, Sharon. I think you're absolutely spot on. I think we have this feeling that we are dependent so much now on all these tech platforms and these systems that we use, and how do we challenge them without losing how they potentially bring or enhance or create opportunities in your life. But you're absolutely right. Cara, I saw you nodding about the prevention piece. I'd love to give you a minute to add any more, and then Amna, I'd love to give you a chance to, if that's possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Honestly, every single word you just said, I totally agree with. Essentially, my fundamental concern is I think our political institutions aren't ready for how AI is going to, I think it could dismantle our democracy. It's a real threat to the sanctity of our democracy because, if you can make a lie look like a truth and give that to the public, it completely takes away from, it adds a new lens to how you view your elected representatives and candidates. And I absolutely do believe that there's a racial element to this, a gendered element to this. I think, people do not like to see, as you said there, all about women stepping into their power and being at positions of power, being at tables where decisions are made. And that's absolutely where each and every one of us belong. We are 50% of the population globally. And I really do think, when it comes to our electoral commissions or it comes to our parliament buildings across the globe, there really is a duty to hone in on how AI will impact who people vote for and impact the way in which they're perceived. And my fundamental fear is that we will see those young, aspiring female politicians who want to step up and serve their communities shy away from these hugely important places where we can serve our community and serve our country and do our best, that they'll shy away from that because all it will take is the push of a button and you can ruin someone's life. And even in my experience, being in a position of, lawmaking, the support just isn't there. When you go to the police, their intent, they're very kind and a listening ear. They don't have the cybercrime tech to support. A lot of older cops may not have an understanding of the tech. You're very much on your own. And I know if I found that really intimidating at the height of an election, 2 weeks out from voting day, I can't imagine how a younger woman, 17, 18 or whatever, might feel. So I think when we, open this issue up, what we'll see is AI is going to shape the outcomes of our elections and going to shape the candidates for whom we can vote for, due to that rise in fear of having your appearance or your likeness or your sexuality weaponized against you because you're so bold to step into the political remit or sports or journalism. And I think that's really grossly unfair.
Thank you so much, Cara. You're absolutely fine. 100% agree. Amna, I wondered if you had any thoughts on on what prevention looks like. But also, if you wanted to spend a moment just I know that you've done significant work in trying to equip the first responders to respond more effectively, and you've had some great success in that. If you'd want to touch on both of those, please.
I think I'm going to start with prevention. I think everything that has been said so far, I completely agree. One of the things I would just mention about the piecemeal approach to prevention, I think that is something that we should be talking about, how we should not have governments, international organizations doing different works, trying to bring about the same change. So I think getting them together and having a holistic approach towards prevention is what would work. And I'd also feel that as a law enforcement officer and somebody who's been working in the space, deterrence is the best form of prevention. And I keep talking about impunity. I think there is massive impunity in this domain. So deterrence for both the social media platforms, deterrence for both the perpetrators. So if we want the system to be survivor-centric, the justice system to be responding to it in a survivor-centric way, we should also have the justice system so strong that the perpetrator know that the cognizance would be taken of their actions. Right now, there is no such thing that we see, and probably one of the reasons that there's this quantum of complaints have increased massively over time. And I think one of the things that you said that I'm going to go back to the point that Nigat mentioned about having a system in place when the laws are designed. So completely, honestly, I feel that human and material resources are of paramount importance if we talk about having a survivor-centric approach to the criminal justice system responding to TFGBV. And until and unless we have ample human and material resources, it's going to be extremely hard. As a law enforcement officer, I can tell you over the past few years, the quantum of complaints of technology-facilitated gender-based violence have massively increased. And the systems just do not have the capacity to respond to everything. And this has been so quick. So in a way, the systems have not kept up, and the quantum of complaints have increase, and they're going to increase more. So in that regard, I feel that one of the ways that we in Pakistan, I think, as Nigat mentioned, in some ways we are far ahead than other countries. We have just drafted the national strategy to address technology facilitated gender-based violence, which is probably the first in the continent. And one of the ways that it addresses, this resource problem is by talking about leveraging the existing digital infrastructures in the country to ensure that, for the time being, while the other resources are marshaled, we can just use what exists in terms of, survivor-centric approach in the criminal justice system and try and accommodate the survivors accordingly. So I think while the systems are put in place, in the meanwhile, what exists and what has been successful should be utilized to ensure that survivors have a recourse in the criminal justice system when they're faced with TFGBV.
Thank you so much for that. That's really interesting. And I find that what you're saying about that the number of complaints that are coming now are bigger than you can measure, and that every day is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think one of the things that we're seeing from sort of a responding space in the UK in particular is that we don't have the services set up in such a way to provide that journey of support, and that many of people who are experiencing texted gender-based harm, their avenue to access support is the police. Do I contact a domestic abuse or sexual violence service? Do I fit into that sort of category, and can I engage with it? And who do I talk to? So there's a whole piece. And again, Nijat, so going back to what you mentioned around having that whole journey available. Sarah, just moving on to sort of the work that you're doing, what is the Inter-American model law to prevent and eradicate gender-based violence? And why do you think it's important across the Americas?
Thank you, Lindsay. So I wish I could answer that question in only 3 minutes, but I'll do my best to explain this piece of model legislation. But before that, I would like to give a brief context on what is the follow-up mechanism to the Belém do Pará Convention. The Belém do Pará Convention is the Inter-American Convention to prevent, punish, and eradicate gender-based violence against women. And it has already been mentioned, the Global South actually is always seen as someone who follows, but in this case, the Inter-American Convention was the first convention addressing violence against women in the world. It was the first convention that saw this as a problem that must be at the top of the agenda of the states in the Americas, in this case, Latin America and the Caribbean. So Taking from that, the convention has its own follow-up mechanism, and it has a committee of experts that can approve model legislation for states parties to the convention to have guidance, to have a path to follow regarding cases of violence against women. So this model legislation is the first comprehensive legal framework for Latin America and the Caribbean that not only defines violence, digital violence against women, but it also gives, as I mentioned before, a comprehensive route that starts at prevention, but also includes reparation, new forms of reparation for women, and guarantees of non-repetition. Because we must be creative with these new types of violence, because as we already mentioned, the judiciary, the justice system is not prepared for this kind of cases. For example, in Latin America, judges still don't understand what this kind of violence means. So if they can't even understand what happens to a victim of digital violence, they cannot implement a real solution for that victim. So I think that the three most important things to mention about the model law, first of all, is that it defines gender-based digital violence against women. I'm going to say something controversial, considering that we have been referring to technology-facilitated gender-based violence, but the committee of experts decided to name this kind of violence as gender-based digital violence because the name technology-facilitated meant neutrality. And by now, we know that it's not neutral, that technology, digital technology at least, is no longer a neutral, only an intermediary. They are not just facilitating. Right now, they are perpetrating, they are aggravating, and of course, facilitating violence. As we already mentioned as well, digital platforms and tech companies are profiting, are monetizing violence. So that's why we define it as digital violence, and you'll find a comprehensive definition for that. This was an important first step because for our region, for the Americas, we didn't have a one definition that all states could follow. We have some advances in different countries. There are some laws already approved, some bills that has passed regarding digital violence, but as I mentioned, they are mostly punitive and regarding criminal law approaches. So that was a big first step, a definition, and also we name some of its manifestations so states can identify what kind of manifestations does digital violence imply. And also that is not only criminal, but it can also be approached by a civil law perspective, an administrative law perspective, even an electoral law perspective, because as it was also said, it's affecting a lot of women in public and political life. So also, as I mentioned before, this model law proposes a co-regulation mechanism, which means the states imposes like general obligations, and tech companies or internet intermediaries decide how to follow these general obligations that the law is stating. So some of these obligations includes legal representation in the country, a complaint mechanism, an appeal mechanism, and a third revision mechanism for those complaints. And also, of course, transparency. We need to know how the algorithm works. How we need to be the ones in charge of what information is used to feed the algorithm, and of course, also safety by design and by default. These technologies should be built with risk assessments that allow them to understand how it may impact women's and girls' lives. So these are just some of the regulations. Of course, I would like to mention everything, but just to summarize, it is definition, it goes on prevention measures for the states, then regulation for internet intermediaries or digital platforms, and finally the last chapter is about judicial proceedings. How can the justice systems improve to attend to respond to digital violence cases? And of course, we know that women are not accessing to justice systems for regular kinds of violence, or not regular, but the traditional kinds of violence. So if it's not working for those types of violence that we already know how to approach, or we are more familiar with it, then how can we expect the justice system to work for someone who has been a victim of something we cannot even understand by now? So I will leave it there just to respect the time, but of course, we are happy to continue talking about this, and I'm very happy. I'm very glad that we have a lot of examples from the Global South, because we are really trying to implement these laws that goes beyond only criminalization. And just one more thing. There's an important obligation on budget. We do not need symbolic budgets anymore. We need real budgets that support these laws, because without the resources, our states are not going to be able to implement any of these ideas.
Thank you so much, Shara. That's really, really interesting that you took a moment to put a definition in place and look at it from across the board. I think what I've heard today is that there are moments of some parts of the world have great legislation, some parts have good legislation, and other parts of the world have some legislation. I think one of the things that we always comes into a question is that when you enter a digital space, if you go online, you are no longer in your particular country that you live in. You are speaking and you're engaging with people from around the world. And I suppose the question that always sort of arises is, if your perpetrator of digital harm sits in a country that you don't know of because they're hiding behind a VPN, or they haven't disclosed, or you have no way of finding out, how do you ensure that you can have a piece of legislation that can cover that moment? Or can it exist? Does it exist? Or how do we need to be more honest with our legal systems about what our in-country opportunities around responding with regards to legislation can be? So this is a question to the entire panel. It's a big one. So my question is this: how do we create legislation that works across different legal systems and jurisdictions? Can it work? Can it not work? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Udis, can I start with you?
Yeah, so I believe that it could work. We all got to come together and work, internationally. Even if, let's say, for instance, the PROTECT Act gets passed in the US, then we still need it in every single country, like European Union, African Union, United Nations. Everybody needs to come along and pass it internationally, right? Because otherwise they're just going to use a VPN, which is going to redirect the IP addresses, and they can upload from another country, right? And then another way we can ensure that this is happening is we can get Google to basically support it and make sure that they're also implementing it from their own side. And somebody else said something, and I wanted to kind of address that as well while we're at it. So, for instance, when somebody uploads to these adult platforms, they already have the technology. They have the technology, and some of the bigger platforms, they already implemented it, right? So the only people that this would affect are people that are uploading non-consensual content and child sexual abuse materials to adult platforms. It's not gonna ID verify or any forms of surveillance or anything like that to people that are not uploading non-consensual content and child sexual abuse material. And when they try to upload it, it would just block it from ever being uploaded. So there's no surveillance aspect from it. And I just wanted to put that out there, because I think that that's a narrative that the opposition and obviously pedophiles and predators, they like to go on that perspective, right? So I definitely think there's a way we can all combine our forces. And I also open up the room for anyone. If anyone wants to reach out to me to work together to implement the Protect Act in, their countries or in countries that they think would support it, please let me know and reach out. I'm all for collaboration. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Liz. I love that working together. Nihad, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cross-border problem is not symmetrical. For instance, when a woman in Pakistan is targeted by someone outside of Pakistan, or when her intimate images are hosted on servers in jurisdictions that don't recognize image-based abuse as a crime, she has essentially no recourse. But what we have seen is when governments want data from platform or want content removed for national security purposes, platforms move considerably faster. So the cross-border framework, we know that it already exists, but it just doesn't work for survivors. So I think what would actually help is mutual legal assistance treaties, AMLET, that are fit for purpose in gender-based violence cases, not just for counterterrorism and financial crime that these states basically always use, and maybe this is more is aspirational, but the regional bodies, I really feel, need to be empowered or really need to take this issue at hand. For instance, I can look into, the African Union or ASEAN is also looking into it, the Asia Pacific regional body. SARC is another body, which is the South Asian body. So I think being supported, if these bodies are being supported to develop binding frameworks rather than just voluntary guidelines, I think it will be very useful for regions. But and What it means is that platforms being held to a consistent global standard of care, not a tiered system where users in the global south get slower response time, less transparent appeal processes, and policies that really were not designed with global majority folks in mind or their context in mind. So I also think as a lawyer that cross border legislation is hard, but part of why it's hard is that the political will to resolve to solve it correlates strongly with whose citizens are doing the harm, not whose citizens are being harmed. Yeah, I'll just stop it here, and yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you so much for that. Shay, I think you've got something you want to say.
Yeah, I think I want to just clarify the point that I made earlier about how we have to be careful about how safety gets used against us. So there are historical examples where where minoritized communities, Black women, in the name of countering terrorism, safety tools and tech get used with then the creep function over time that the state will say, we need more powers, we need more powers. So what we need to ensure is that where we already have mass unprecedented levels of distrust in all institutions, particularly around governments and around health after COVID-19, that more people are distrusting of wanting to give up their data, which, I was amazed and shocked at the backlash to a little bit of friction for people to access pornography, a little bit of friction by adding their date of birth caused this ripple effect that almost took down the Online Safety Act, when we at the same time watched the Netflix show Manosphere, and we saw the vulnerabilities of the online space and how it's impacting boys. But what we often see is the minoritized women, children are often used in political point scoring for greater powers around surveillance and around tech power. And if we don't name that uncomfortability, we grow in the distrust and we lose our ability to have people join our efforts. To come back to your question about what are the things that we can do to ensure that we don't have the lazy response, I think, from governments and institutions to say, oh, well, that happened in that jurisdiction, so we can't get involved. Well, let's look, for example, at Interpol. Interpol exists for that very reason. Let's have a look at copyright legislation when it comes to taking down music or videos of people dancing with music. That gets taken down. Doesn't matter what jurisdiction you are in. Or let's look at the amount of cross-sector, multi-stakeholder resources and individuals and organizations involved in countering child sexual exploitation images. So we have seen the ability to move across borders and not let that impact us. And I think the 4 ways that we can do that is to have a principle-led approach, to have international frameworks set a principle and standard of saying, look, this is what we did to rebuild our welfare states after the war. After World War I, World War II, we saw mass devastation across the world. How are we now making sure that we are building welfare states? We are building the safety nets. We're building our education systems with technology revolution or evolution. That is a principal approach, and we've seen that happen often. So the 4 ways I would recommend is that we say it doesn't matter what country you're part of or where this happens, we need to have a documentation protocol. Every country should be able to have a resourced helpline that is trauma-informed, consent-led, and has never capture boundaries, so that we are documenting what happens. The more we document, the more we can feed ChatGPT and Claude or whatever around the patterns and foreseeable patterns of abuse. Second issue that we don't have a standardized harm classification system. So we, 1 minute are using online gender-based violence, next minute we're using TGBV. I don't know what it's going to be in 3 years' time. Whatever it is, we need to be able to identify the harm and classify this so that it allows for standardization. We also need to be able to identify harm when it goes from online to offline, because what I fear is tech-facilitated gender-based violence will become this separate issue in the conversation of Vogue, when we know that actually tech has been able to exacerbate already existing offline issues and also create a digital divide. Then we also need to have governance frameworks that has escalation thresholds, as discussed by others earlier, that when we see X happening, X heat map here, X situation has unfolded, we see peak times around elections, etc. We need to be having escalation thresholds. We see this when it comes to protests, when it comes to festivals. We put duties on pubs, on clubs, to ensure they have better security. When we have more people using a particular outlet, or they are out, Arsenal won the Champions League the other day, we had police out in force, making sure that everyone feels safe. So why don't we have the same escalation thresholds when it comes to the online space? And the most important for me is the responsibility flow model, because what tends to happen is tech companies blame the police, and the police blame the government, and government blame parents. What we need to do is have defined responsibility for platforms, for employers and organizations. What do they do when one of their employees is a victim of tech facilitated violence in their own organization? Funders and boards as well. Funders and philanthropy are also an important stakeholder in how they are funding this. At the moment, they are still funding reactive projects. They're not funding the thinking, the R&D that tech bros get to have. They get to think, oh, let's just be in a room and create an app, and that's gonna applause men because they feel really low about themselves. They get the opportunity to dream and imagine, yet women don't. And finally, regulators and public bodies also have a responsibility. So we can define these responsibility flows and set principles, because we have done that in other forms of evolution or revolution in history. The argument that we can't do it now, I'll bring it back to my original point, is just a storytelling myth. We can redesign these systems.
Thank you so much for that, Shane. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to the sort of next question, which asks that everyone it's the end of the summit, it's a positive moment, to say the least. If you could say just one thing about what is the most important step that needs to happen globally right now to better protect people from tech-facilitated harm and abuse, what would it be? All these.
Well, I already said it over and over. Prevention before harm occurs. I think that that's the number one solution. I said Protect Act, and then also everybody else said it. I believe that these platforms, the tech companies, they have the technology. We know that they have the technology. They know, everybody knows, but we just need to basically just implement it and make sure that it prevents the harm from ever occurring.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Cara, one thing that you think that could make a difference right now to better protect people?
I think legislators being trauma informed and victim centered and hearing directly the stories and the impact and using that to shape adequate legislation that can meet them where they are. But aside from that, also, making sure that these social media giants and tech companies recognize the moral and the professional duty that they have to keep users safe as well.
Thank you so much for that. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's have been a lot of conversations going on regulation, on AI, artificial intelligence, digital platforms, tech companies. But I think that any kind of regulation must include a gender perspective and a human rights-based perspective. And I think that's what's missing right now. We have a lot of fragmented conversations on different kinds of regulation on technology, but we are not including the voices of women, our experiences, and of course, we are more than half of the population, but we are still not an urgent matter. So I think that right now, what we can do, and I think that we are getting there, and we are progressing towards that goal, is including a gender perspective in any kind of regulation that directly affects women, and of course, most importantly, any kind of regulation about technology must include women's perspectives.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. So survivors, women in particular, you had one thing that you think could make a difference right now.
I mean,
Just
this
one.
this is this is specific, but also very aspirational, and I think we can dream big. Um, can we have binding international standards on platform accountability for gender-based violence? Not voluntary commitments, not only self-regulatory commitments or initiatives, not another multi-stakeholder process that produce a report that nobody implements. So, maybe something internationally that is binding. Yeah. I mean, it's my dream. I don't know whether we can achieve that, but we can at least dream big.
No, I think it's important. It is having and it's holding those tech companies into that space, isn't it? And that collectively we are their customer base and we have power in the collective. Shay, your final thought that could make a difference.
Exactly what I was going to say. I think actually we're not going to win the gender argument because we're not winning this. We're not in the driving seat around the storytelling, and what at the moment everyone is focused on, particularly those in political power, is the economy. And you can make an economic argument for safety. You can make an economic argument for centering the safety of women and designing against violence against women and girls. And so I think that's the first step is let's start talking about this as good business practice, good economic practice, good growth. You think, okay, you're taking £10 million for this election and you're giving away NHS data here in the UK or XYZ now. But if you look in the long term, how this is going to cost us from a public health approach when it comes to children presenting with suicide ideation in schools, how mental health workers are stretched, how parents won't be able to cope in the next 5 to 10 years. That comes at an economic cost. So I think the most important step now is how do we translate gender-based violence, which was always meant to be a sociological lens into seeing power dynamics and dominance, not an identity tool and not a conversation where we stop at, but how do we use that to say, let's reimagine the resources and say, this is how we have an economic, good business, good governance practice for technology in the future.
That's a really great space for us to finish. And thank you so much, Shay, for that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and particularly our panelists. I could speak to you, and I'm sure everyone could listen for hours and hours and hours. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion. I love that we've all agreed that survivors need to be at the beginning and in part of every stage of the formation of legislation, that there is space for regulation, but actually there's a huge piece about us collectively coming together and holding them to account. And I sincerely hope the work we'll do together will bring in that binding document. I echo from everyone here and everyone who's joined us that if you want to reach out to any of the members of the panel via their organizations, all the details are attached, along with the many, many resources that have been mentioned through this great discussion. And I thank you again for your time, for sharing your thoughts and your experiences with us. It is immensely amazing from my perspective. So thank you very, very much.